Back a year ago.
This episode of the Beer Bound Podcast is brought to you by Rolling Hops Beer Tours.
Hey everybody, Garrett here from Rolling Hops, as always joined with my partner,
Andy.
We're here to tell you guys about our virtual craft beer tour offering. With what's going on in the world, unfortunately, we haven't been able to run our historical craft walking beer tour, so we've pivoted to taking the virtual experience of craft beer directly to you guys. Wonderful for team building events, corporate events, even just a night out or in, for that matter, with your friends and family. And we're doing this online.
Have any questions about the beer tours or want us to tailor make an event for you? Just shoot us an email or send us a message on any form of social media. Rolling Hops, you can find us everywhere.
RollingHopsBeerTours.com is where you can get a hold of us, and we'll see you guys soon.
Cheers.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Beer Bound Podcast. We're very excited to be joined by Richard Preiss from Escarpment Labs. One can find Escarpment Labs in Guelph, Ontario. Founders Angus Ross, Nate Ferguson, and Richard Preiss all met while working in a yeast research lab at the University of Guelph. A collective love for beer and brewing led them to found Escarpment Laboratories, intending to add value to the craft beverage landscape and hang out in breweries for a living. Not a bad idea. Our guest today, Richard, has a focus on translating new research into exciting products and knowledge for brewers. Richard loves to help his team and the brewers he works with to solve problems, overcome challenges, and unlock efficiencies. One day, Richard will write a manifesto on Brettanomyces. Really want to know more about that. So without further ado, we welcome Richard to the Beer Bound Podcast. Hello, Richard.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Welcome.
Super happy to have you indeed. Richard, start us off. Maybe who are you? I gave a little bit of introduction, but can you give us a little bit more depth into yourself, your connection with beer, and I suppose yeast as well?
Sure. So I'm one of the co-founders of Escarpment Labs. And if we sort of go further back in time, I really, at one point just kind of fell in love with food and beverage and fermentation, and kind of had this epiphany at the start of university that like all of the most delicious things are a product of fermentation. Whether it's coffee or chocolate or bread or beer or wine, like all of these things don't happen without fermentation. All these things are transformed by microbes into something that's greater than the sum of its parts. And that was really inspiring. So that was, at least for me, the trigger to kind of go down this journey with Escarpment Labs. And, when we started our company in 2015, at that time, that was really when craft beer was, it was around, but it really kind of hit this inflection point in terms of taking off here in Ontario and in Canada in general. So we had a really cool opportunity to come in and, offer local yeast that just wasn't available before that. The brewers had to import yeast from the US, and that had a whole lot of challenges associated with it. So, it was kind of right place at the right time in terms of what we do with beer and brewing, but we've been able to grow alongside a lot of the craft breweries, and now we get to consider them friends and work with them and do a lot of really cool stuff, and help a lot of people with fermentation along the way.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Can you tell us, this may be an ignorant question, but how do you make yeast?
You have to start somewhere, right? Like you can't make something from nothing. So but the cool thing about yeast is that it grows exponentially. So you can make a whole lot in a short amount of time. So the sort of absolute basics of how we make yeast, I wish I had props with me, is we start with a yeast colony on an agar plate. So this is like a petri dish. We have, you can get basically a yeast colony that is a little chunk of yeast cells that are growing on top of one another. The cool thing about that technique is you can have a colony that really every single cell is just a copy of one single cell. So you kind of have a pure culture. You can start from that point. So you kind of have a very, very small little speck, but even in that little speck is millions of cells. You can start growing it from there. So for us, it's all like a liquid culture process. You can take that colony and put it in a little bit of basically beer, very similar to beer wort. Let it start growing up. It grows up exponentially. So suddenly from 5 million cells, you have 5 billion cells. You can keep stepping that up until the point where, in some of our propagators, you're getting 400 trillion cells out. So, wow. Quite a lot. And you can go from that little speck up to a full size, propagator of yeast in a week if everything goes according to plan.
So like you said, maybe coming back to what you mentioned there, you said, so that when you're growing that yeast exponentially, it'll all be a pure culture, right? Everything's a replication of that one cell, or at least that one speck that you mentioned you were starting with. So how does yeast then change? I know there's different strains and different varieties. Like, can you change a yeast, or is it just one that's been found that's completely different, and then you grow that one? Is there a way to change a style of yeast?
There's a lot of traditional yeast strains out there because there's so many different beer brewing traditions. So, one thing that's really cool is that the yeasts that are associated with different regions of the world are, also unique in terms of their flavors, their properties, and including their genes. Like English yeast has its own set of properties, and it's different from American yeast, which is different from Belgian yeast. So there's a lot of just really cool diversity just in the natural yeasts that we work with in beer. So brewers have a lot of choice as to how they can drive flavors using just yeast, because all of those natural yeast strains have all sorts of different characteristics. And then probably opening a can of worms here, but beyond that, there are opportunities to manipulate these things. There's lots of different strategies that can be used to kind of push a yeast in one direction or another. Just to kind of provide a general overview, one way you can do it is basically forcing the evolution process, right? You can just put a yeast through a beer fermentation on an accelerated time scale. So you're reproducing what would happen in a brewery in years in a few months. That's one way. You can also crossbreed yeast, just like you can crossbreed plants, or a poodle and a golden retriever, whatever. You can crossbreed yeast and get something that has traits of two different parents. So that's another really cool opportunity. And then something we're starting to see more in the industry is more targeted genetic modification, like GMO processes as well.
Okay, and is that like changing yeast? Is that a no-no, or is that just like crazy scientist stuff and going above and beyond and try and make something new and unique?
Yeah, is there any advocacy for the yeast? The ill treatment of yeast, perhaps.
As far as we know, they don't really feel pain or have any feelings like that. So yeast is vegan, all that good stuff. But I'm always advocating for yeast. I'm always advocating brewers to treat their yeast well. So in some ways, yes, and that's us.
Good stuff. So yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit more about that. What does it mean to treat yeast well? I feel like, maybe in a lot of our events, we talk about, the main ingredients of beer, and the big ones are obviously malt and hops. Those really get the limelight. But yeast is also very, very important. And we're learning more and more that like you said, the treatment of yeast goes a long way, especially in longevity of breweries and consistency of beer and things like that. So maybe you can talk a bit to how you take care of it.
It's super important. I'm not to discredit malt and hops, but you don't have beer without yeast. Right? You have wort, which, like, for anyone who's drank unfermented beer, it's not very delicious. Once the yeast ferments it, it gets delicious. So that's the key point across the board, is like, you don't have beer without yeast. It's absolutely critical to the process. But then along the way, it does a lot of cool stuff, right? Yeast is adding and transforming or removing all sorts of different flavors from those other ingredients. It's kind of the glue that holds the whole thing together. So, different yeasts might have, for example, different flavors. One might taste like pineapple, and that might be awesome in one beer style and completely out of place in another. So, yeast has a really cool opportunity to kind of glue all of those other ingredients together and create a beer that is cohesive as a whole. And on the just sort of speaking to treating it well, like you can taste it. You can taste when a fermentation, a yeast has been stressed out, because that's often how you get off flavors. Some of the common beer off flavors, like the buttery diacetyl or the like green apple acetaldehyde, those kinds of flavors tend to be a result of yeast that is not as happy as it could be.
That's really interesting. Another perhaps foolish question, Richard. For most of the thousands and thousands of years that humans have been creating beer and drinking beer, we haven't had to actually add the yeast. That was just sort of nature's touch. Is that fair to say?
It depends. I think, we didn't know that yeast was yeast for a while. There's some important people in that story, like Louis Pasteur. That's one of the things he's most famous for, is helping to prove that yeast is alive. And this Dutch guy, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, who more or less invented the microscope, he saw yeast, didn't know it was alive, but that was 400 years ago. So, we've known that for a while. That being said, there have been brewing processes where we've reused certain ingredients, or maybe not cleaned out the fermenter for a very, very long time. So even though we didn't know what yeast was, I think we've been using it and manipulating it for a really long time. I do know that there's even going further back in history, I think it's one of the Pliny's, younger or elder, wrote about, people trading yeast way back when, 2000 years ago. So we know that, or whatever, trading fermentation magic, or as it may have been considered at the time. But, this has been going on for a while. We've been deliberately controlling and manipulating fermentations for a really, really long time. So, I like that because it means that I have job security. I don't think humans are ever going to not need, they're never going to not need people who can make sure that things ferment.
Right. I guess I was wrong in that way of knowing about yeast, but not knowing about fermentation. So is it fair to say that, there are some beers that can ferment with natural microcultures like that?
Oh, absolutely.
That is a style. Is that, yeah, I guess, I don't know if I have a question there.
Well, there are beers like that are, spontaneously fermented, like the lambics, for example.
Yeah, of course.
There are examples where you kind of have that influence of the environment, and realistically, what you probably get in those beers is a little bit of what's from the air, a little bit of what's hanging around the brewery. And if I was a yeast and I knew that this brewery, every so often had a bunch of food kicking around and they weren't deliberately adding yeast, then if I were a yeast, I would know to hang around that brewery. So it's an ongoing debate as to like where this stuff's coming from. But yeah, you absolutely can make beer without adding yeast. It's just the results are very different, right? Lambic is almost a completely different beverage than regular beer.
That's maybe, since we're on the topic of lambic, like reading and researching, and we haven't got this question yet, but I've sort of pondered it to myself, because typically beers fall in the ale or the lager category, but lambics are sort of in a style all its own. Do you think you'd agree with that, or is there maybe some argument to shift it to one of the buckets?
It's definitely neither. Like, I think ale and lager is like kind of a product of how like reductionist like the microbiology of beer has gotten, where it's like, are you using this yeast or this yeast, right? And that realistically, that's how things have worked in most places for the last 200 years. But there are these other things that kind of bend that, like lambic, where it's just whatever's hanging around the brewery that day. In that case, you kind of open up a third category of mixed fermentations, or you can then split that into into like a reused mixed fermentation or a spontaneous, I guess, if you want. But really, I would say like that's kind of its own world of like not using, pure ale yeast or lager yeast, but having a mixed culture of a bunch of different things that are fermenting the beer.
Yeah, super interesting. They're definitely very, very interesting beers. Are you a fan of lambic styles?
I am. Yeah, those are some of my favorites.
Yeah. Super unique. Got some really crazy flavors there. Actually, not to like keep focusing on lambic, but just, to your point in the fact that, they're spontaneously fermented and for the most part, you're not adding a yeast, but it just sort of finds its way in there. Even though breweries have been brewing lambic beers for quite some time now, I guess there's an element of consistency there. So is that just specifically from, where the brewery is located that consistency comes from? Or maybe is there a technique? Not that I think you're a lambic expert, but maybe you can, talk to the point, perhaps. The yeast expert anyway, or the microbe.
I think, it's pretty clear that like a lot of the microbes stick around those breweries, and like if you go to them, you'll quickly understand like this isn't like some breweries in North America look like hospitals. This isn't really true of those traditional breweries in Belgium, for example. Like, there's going to be cobwebs. There's going to be a lot of like wood fermenters. There's going to be a lot of like old school gear. Like it kind of creates an environment where you probably do have microbes that kind of just hang around, right? So I have a buddy who spent some time brewing in Belgium, and we were talking about sanitation once, and he said, yeah, we just cleaned with hot water. I think I saw a pail of chemicals once, which is like, if you tell that to a brewer in North America, they're going to freak out.
Yeah. Sanitation is key. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just a different mindset.
Yeah. Cool. Interesting. Okay.
That's wild. Yeah. Because in North America, you sanitization. It's everything in brewing.
Mm-hmm. And whose beers are better? You have to ask that question.
That is true, isn't it? I guess going in more of a practical direction, Richard, what does it take to start a laboratory? Can you walk us through the endeavor itself, the facilities that the three of you have? Has your team expanded since your inception? Can you give us a bit of a story on the enterprise?
Yeah, a lot of work and a lot of trial and error. Like we started out, we had a lot of help along the way. When we started out, Wellington Brewery here in Guelph basically gave us their lab as a playground. So we got to try out a lot of things at small scale. We were even able to start making yeast to sell to breweries out of Wellington, which was awesome because then, we were able to just start scaling up and establish our business without having a ton of overhead, which was great. But we did outgrow that pretty fast. So, we moved into another facility in Guelph, and we were able to, start scaling up and, still figuring out how to make all this work. Like if there's no instruction manual for starting a yeast lab, it's a pretty specialized thing. Everyone's secretive. Like we talked to some other yeast labs when we were starting out as well. And it was like, yeah, you can come talk to us, but I'm not going to show you our facility kind of thing. So it's a little different from breweries. Cause like if you went to a brewery and said, hey, I'm starting a brewery, they're going to show you everything. Right.
Yeah.
So we had to figure a lot of stuff out ourselves, in retrospect, that's a good thing because it forces you to be creative and forces you to think critically about what you're doing. And so I think it's forced us to get, really efficient about what we do. So yeah, like at that point, we were able to start building a team, and, that's been a whole journey as well. We have, a lot of awesome people on the team that contribute a lot of, really cool specialized skills and, make the whole thing happen, which has been really, really awesome to see as well. We're not really the star players anymore, the owners. We're more like coaches, and that's been a really fun transition. And then now we're at the point where we have our crew split between two facilities. So we have one facility in Guelph that makes the yeast and one that basically stores and ships it. And that's pretty cool to see as well. And learning all of these things, like the original facility is basically an old auto garage that we converted over. The new one is a brand new building, and like just learning the things like, how much nicer it is to work in a building that's not, decades old. Things like that as well is pretty important.
It was interesting what you said about just how competitive the yeast industry is. That's strange. I wonder if you could give us your take on that, why you think that is. And I believe, like, is yeast proprietary? Like, if you come up with your own, like this, aren't there some large breweries that have their own particular strain of yeast and you're not allowed to replicate it?
Yeah. So, I mean, part of the reason that it's a little bit more secretive and more competitive is because there isn't a lot of propriety around the yeast themselves. Like, a lot of the yeasts that we offer, that most yeast companies offer, are these traditional yeasts that have basically been around for a long time, that anyone has access to, right? It's almost like public domain. Or like heirloom seeds kind of thing. So everyone has access to them. So consequently, like, the knowledge around making the yeast becomes a lot more valuable versus the yeast strains themselves. That is starting to change. And like, sort of to speak to your question, like, yeah, there are some breweries that have their own proprietary strains. They might protect that by basically only having it stored and produced in a specific place. Like we have some clients who bank yeast with us, for example, and we're not allowed to grow it for anyone else. Or they might protect it through secrecy as well. They just don't want people to know what they're using. But on the other hand, like, what we're starting to see is, like, as there's a little bit more biotechnology coming into play, whether that's yeast breeding or whether that's genetic modification, any of these things, then you get into a place where, someone's actually deliberately done something to change the yeast. So you're actually able to get into the world of, like, patents and things like that. Or maybe someone wants to trademark the name of a strain so that someone else can't sell it as the same name. Like, we've seen a bit of that going on in the yeast industry. So, things are getting a little bit more advanced in all of these fronts.
So if Garrett and I started our own yeast laboratory and we came to Richard and said, "Hey, can we check out your facility?" What would you say?
It's a judgment call. I have.
Sounds like you wouldn't let us in.
There's some people that have been planning places out in New Zealand and Australia, and I'll let them take a look. It depends.
As long as they're on the other side of the world. Yeah, interesting. That is neat.
Yeah, that's cool. I guess you just got to be wary of those folks sitting outside a brewery with the petri dish.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, like, that's that arrangement is. I think most yeast companies are kind of moving toward, like, let's all have unique products, and then we're able to compete with each other in a bit of a healthier way, a bit of a more clear way. I'm okay with that. Mm-hmm. And that's exciting too, because then it's like we're not necessarily competing for, like, who can have the lowest price California ale. We're competing for, like, who can make the coolest yeast.
Mm-hmm. Seems a little bit nicer, I suppose, than race to the bottom. It's more like, okay, well, who can be the most creative? I feel like that's probably a little bit better of a competition, which is good. Well, to that effect, Andy and I always, like, obviously we gave the contrast between, like, what you were saying about yeast companies and breweries being very, very open. And a lot of that comes down to, like, an educational component, just checking out, some of the area on your site. You have, like, blogs and different events and things like that. So is that sort of maybe part of the original mandate of Escarpment Labs? Was also, apart from just, creating yeast, but then educating the craft beer industry?
Yeah, like, that's beyond just making yeast available in Canada. Like, that was really number two reason for us to exist, was sharing knowledge. Like, it was our feeling, especially early on, that there was just not a lot of good knowledge out there on everything surrounding yeast and beer fermentation. So that's always been one of our focuses, is sharing fermentation knowledge, or if it doesn't exist, going out and doing the experiment and creating our own and sharing that. And that's been, a guiding principle for us as well, is, we have to make it easy for people. If, something that's helpful to people is not accessible, it's in, academic journals and stuff like that, let's make it accessible to them and easy to understand. If no one's done the experiment, let's go do it and find out what's going on, in terms of whatever question we're asking, right? Maybe it's about yeast flavor or something like that. So that's been critical, and that's why we focus a lot on things like the blog, and we're still pretty active in scientific publishing. We do webinars, YouTube videos, all this stuff just to try to help people understand fermentation better.
Yeah, that's cool. That's always good. And Andy and I always try to educate ourselves a little bit more on everything we do. And like we were saying before, the limelight is the hops and malt, but we are trying to learn a little bit more about yeast because it plays a really big factor, like you were saying. Definitely goes a long way. So like did I hear correctly? You said actually doing like science publications. My wife has a science background, and she always raves about the Journal of Nature. I believe it's Nature, I think it's called. Is it? Are we talking that big? Like, is it that prestigious? Getting something into that effect? I'm not a science guy. This is just what I'm hearing as a spouse of a scientist.
Yeah, one day. I'm not going to make it a a life goal or anything like that. But if we can ever publish in like, there's they say the big three: Cell, Science, Nature. One of those, that would be awesome. That would be great. Wouldn't complain. But no, we're not necessarily publishing in journals that big right now. It tends to be more specialized, like industry or applied journals.
Richard, can you tell us about the industry a little bit more? How competitive is it? Are there a lot of different labs that are similar to your size? Are there massive players who kind of dominate the scene? Can you give us a bit of an umbrella, overarching glimpse at what the industry is like?
Sure. I think it's gotten very, very vibrant, I would say, and very healthy. Like when we were starting up, there was really not a whole lot of options for brewers. We started up with the focus on Canada, and that remains the focus. We do have customers other places in the world as well. But starting up, it was really kind of the sort of established yeast companies like White Labs and Y Yeast. Those were kind of the big two. Around the same time we were starting, there was other companies like Omega and Imperial that have really grown a lot, and they've become pretty big players in the US. And then there's also been this whole wave of like what I'm going to call is boutique or more local yeast producers as well. So I mean, you can almost consider us like that boutique yeast producer for Canada, recognizing that Canada's beer market is the same size as California's, right? In the US, you can fit in a lot of these guys. So there's, other small yeast producers that we really respect, like Bootleg Biology and Jasper and Inland Island. There's a whole bunch of them that are kind of serving a more local purpose, like in their specific states or regions. And like that's the cool thing, because you have like every company does have a slightly different focus, which has been nice to have that kind of diversification as well.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about your focus? Are there particular yeasts that you're more attached to, that you're more interested in developing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things that we've been focusing a lot on is yeast breeding. It's not really something that's been really, no one's really, dove deep into that topic. There's a couple other products on the market, but it's something where we started to see a lot of potential, and we've been diving deep a lot into, whereas a lot of the other companies that are doing like other forms of strain improvement are kind of going straight into the GMO end of things. And in some ways that makes sense, but we see a lot of value in breeding yeasts, hybridizing yeasts. And the cool thing there is that it's, you don't have to worry about the GMO status and things like that. You can actually get some really, really cool results from it. So that would say that's kind of one of our unique angles, is offering new strains that are created through breeding rather than through gene editing, for example.
So through breeding, Richard, is it fair to say that there's no end to the diversity that we could eventually obtain because of breeding? Is that fair to say, or is there a finite amount of strains of yeast that we can finally get to?
Oh, it's infinite, because you can take two strains and breed them, and you have something that's maybe improved. but maybe it's missing some other traits. So you have something else that gets crossed into it, like has been done in, plant breeding and animal breeding for years and years and years. Like, I think we're still at a pretty primitive stage with yeast breeding. Like, a lot of the yeasts that are used in the industry haven't changed in, 50, 60, 70 years. They've kind of just been like locked in their, natural state, which is fine. But like, if we were using corn from 70 years ago, we would have major problems in our food chain, right? So like, I think that there's a lot of room for improvement. And like, just like in crops, like breeding's kind of the obvious angle. And then if we need to make targeted modifications to, meet specific needs, like in yeast, it might be to drive certain flavors. In crops, it's like drought tolerance, stuff like that. Then that makes sense. But I think like there's still a ton of opportunity and like almost a limitless amount of outcomes that we can get through that approach.
If you're going to sort of manipulate yeast a little bit like that to drive a certain characteristic, are you seeing that from maybe customers? Like, hey, like this yeast was wonderful, but it would be great if it had more pineapple, like you were kind of saying before, or something to that effect. And is it relatively easy to say, okay, someone's saying I need more pineapple, I can easily do that, I just have to do X, Y, and Z? Or is it a whole experiment afterwards?
Yeah, it's definitely getting to that point. And I think that is like one of the desires is, from the customer's perspective, from the brewer's perspective of, I like this yeast, but I want it to do a little bit more, a little bit less of X, right? Pineapple flavor, that's a great example. So in some cases, there's already tried and true methods to sort of enhance or change those traits. In other cases, it really is an experiment, right? So, that specific one, it's like there's a lot of good ideas. No one's really kind of proven it 100% yet. So, we're not quite there, but I would say, in the next 2 years, you're going to have yeasts that are enhanced for pineapple aromas, 100%.
Cool. And I guess that is the thought of that experimentation as a yeast expert in the industry. Is that kind of like, that's what gets you going? That's the exciting challenge of, the professional and the yeast industry.
I think that's what's really exciting to the brewers, and it's also exciting to me. From my end, it's also just really exciting to understand better how the yeasts work, because then that it's sort of this like cycle, right, where there's only so much we can do because we're doing, any changes we're making, any tweaks we're making are based on our existing knowledge. As soon as we expand that knowledge, we can turn the wheel again. We can do something else. So that's kind of what excites me, is balancing those two things, between fundamentally understanding the yeast and how it works, and then being able to apply that and create a product that people can use.
Yeah, you spoke about improvements, Richard, always seeking improvements in the strains you're creating. Can you maybe, for a fool like me, can you tell me exactly some improvements that you're really searching for?
It's really what the brewers are searching for. So, I mean, that might depend on the brewers, but there's like certain things that really matter to them. Number one is reliability. Is this going to work the same way every single time I buy it? And that's a hard thing to nail down, because there's so many things that can go wrong when you grow yeast. And some yeast strains are kind of better for that than others. And then beyond that, it's other things like the flavor or the efficiency, right? Is it going to deliver the flavors that I want for the beer that I'm making? Once again, is it going to be reliable? And then, there's also efficiency, right? How long is it going to take me to make this beer, right? Most brewers prefer something that takes less time to ferment, as an example. So there's like certain things that are kind of universally desired.
You said a lot of things can go wrong. How many things, and what are they?
I think we've seen them all at this point, or almost all of them. Yeah, I mean, even something we've seen is like we grow the yeast in wort, in malt-based wort, just like brewers make beer. That's a product of agriculture. So depending on where that barley is grown and the conditions of the climate that year, it changes. And so we're constantly, dealing with and managing a process that's basically dependent on Mother Earth, right? So that's always tricky because, even if we look at the malt, it changes from year to year and we have to make adjustments so that the yeast is consistent. And then going on, beyond that, the process is a lot of steps, and some of those steps do impact the yeast, right? Like, is it being held at the right temperatures during the process? How is it being handled when it's moved from one, tank to another? Things like that can impact a lot. So I don't know if I provided a very good example, but like lots of things can go wrong. And, we've had to figure out a lot of that, sort of over time and on the fly, right? Early on, we might have had there might be situations where, we didn't know that some yeasts were really foamy and, we're losing 50% of the batch to the floor because it got really foamy. All sorts of things can happen.
And what about you? You spoke a little bit, Richard, about the shipping and the transportation of yeast. How complicated is that? Is that something that you do internally? Is that something you contract out to someone? What's the process?
Yeah, that's one of our challenges. Like, I wouldn't. There's a reason why no one else started a yeast company in Canada, because it is one of the absolute most challenging countries to manage logistics of perishable stuff in when you have customers all over the country. Like, we have customers in the Yukon, Northwest Territories, remote parts of Nova Scotia, northern BC. Like, all of these places are incredibly challenging to ship to in a way that is both fast and cost effective for the customer. So we've had to learn a heck of a lot about logistics. I think we would have had an easier time in literally any other country other than Canada. So we're like
climates across the
whole,
whole
and that's the other thing too, is like, this past fall is a great example, like the flooding in BC. Like, okay, now how do we get yeast to our customers in Vancouver? Why are there delays to our customers in Calgary? Oh, it's because everything's routed through Calgary now. Because the trucks can't get through BC. Like, all of this stuff ends up mattering. So our logistics people have really tough jobs because they have to be on top of what's going where all over this big country, and this big country that's pretty susceptible to some pretty crazy weather. We've figured out a lot of it. We've ironed out a lot of the kinks, but stuff always comes up.
Massive country with a small population, not great for logistics for sure. So in terms of say you're delivering to a craft brewery in the Yukon, how much are they actually purchasing from you? Like, what quantities are we talking?
It depends on the size of the brewery, right? Bigger breweries need to purchase more yeast. Our customers in the Yukon are, I would say, pretty mid-sized. I don't know if that's helpful, but we might be shipping them a couple, like 2 or 3 jugs of yeast at a time.
2 or 3 jugs. So how big is a jug? Like
a 10-liter jug.
10 liter.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Those, like, I'm assuming those vary, and maybe to my, I wanted to get to sort of, you've already mentioned that you do have customers countrywide, which is great. And it sounds like most of them are brewers. Is that fair to say? Like, actual, like, established breweries as opposed to home brewers? I think I saw you have homebrew packs available on your website. So there's probably a small population of those home brewers, but is there still a good portion of them?
Oh, there's a ton of home brewers. Like the way that it works is a little bit different on that side. So for breweries, it's all direct. Like, if you're a brewery, you're going to order direct from us. We're going to ship direct to you. For the homebrew, we have more of a wholesale model. So we sell it to homebrew shops, like local homebrew shops all over the country, and then they offer it to their customers. So if you're a homebrew shop in Calgary, you're gonna pick up 50 packs from Escarpment, and then you're gonna sell that on to the local homebrewers in town. So by numbers, the number of homebrew packs vastly outweighs the number of pro yeast orders. It's just a lot less yeast, right? Because a pro might be pitching yeast into 4,000 liters of beer, where a home brewer is doing 20 liters.
Yeah, that's good. So I guess more B2B for getting it to the home brewer then. Okay.
Yeah, you can order from us as well, but we also just try to make sure that the shops are cheaper, so that people support those local shops, because they're so important.
Yeah, that's true. Could you walk into Escarpment Labs and just grab something to go?
No, you do have to order ahead. You can pick it up.
Okay, well, that's not bad either. Yeah.
Is it fair to say that that Escarpment Labs is growing, Richard? Like, are you seeing with the development of craft breweries continuing to grow? Is it, I mean, you said a lot of your business is to do with home brewing, but do you find that you do get a steady flow of new craft breweries, or perhaps newer craft breweries reaching out to you with requests? Or how does the process go in terms of you obtaining clients?
Yeah, pre-COVID, the growth was like very steady and predictable. During COVID, it's been all over the place, which has been interesting. Like, we actually had a very, very good year in 2020 because, most of the breweries kind of weathered the storm of the early pandemic. It was still kind of, I've called it like the pandemic adrenaline. Like, people were still kind of drinking and like not really sure what to do with themselves. So like things were overall pretty healthy in 2020. It's like 2021 where we saw a lot of trouble. Like the beer sales, especially in a lot of the smaller breweries that had more of like a tap room focused model or a restaurant focused model, like they lost a lot of sales. They lost a lot of volume. So, I would say a large chunk of our customers were struggling in 2021. So, consequently, we slowed down a little bit as well. We've still grown, but not as much as we usually would year over year. But there's reason to be optimistic now because we're seeing a lot of breweries starting to get busy kind of as the pandemic is moving on to a less, I mean, it's still there, but like a less acute phase, right? So we're looking at probably a full summer of people going to bars and restaurants and drinking beer, which will be really, really healthy for the industry.
I'm just really curious about this. I'm sorry, Richard, to go so far into the sales process, but does a brewery come to you and say, this is what I'm looking for, make this for me? Or is it a brewery comes to you and says, what do you got? And then Richard says, this is what I can give you. Like, how, does that make sense? Does it, do you tailor to them, or do they just say?
It's a bit of both. So it all depends. Like, what I would say is, like, for most of the more established breweries, if they're coming to us for the first time, they're going to come and say, hey, we're getting yeast from this other place. What's your equivalent, kind of thing? And we'll tell them the closest match. Other times they'll come to us and say, hey, we're planning a new brand. This is what, these are the flavors we want. What do you recommend? And, we get to look at our catalog and make a recommendation. It's fairly rare that someone's like, build this for me, but I think that that's going to be part of the future, is breweries really specifying like precisely what they want, and yeast companies being able to deliver on that. So like, that's not really the present situation, but I think that that's what's coming in the future, is breweries recognizing, like, I don't want the same yeast as the other 4 breweries in the neighborhood. What can you do for me that's unique? And how do I use this as a selling feature for my brewery, right?
You could play that as a selling feature for Escarpment Labs as well. It sounds like that would be your differentiating factor. Like, are you setting, I'm assuming, given that this is sort of on your mind, short of Andy's prying questions on it, I'm sure you've probably had it on your mind, and I guess you're setting yourselves up maybe to take advantage of that down the road. Is that part of the plan?
Absolutely. It's on our mind. I will say easier said than done, but the more we do it, the more we practice, the easier it gets. So we're doing some, what I'll say is like early stage trials of doing some yeast customization, like for specific breweries. And if we're, happy with how that works out, then we're going to be looking at kind of keeping that wheel spinning.
Yeah, I suspect it's a lot of time. If someone comes to you and says, I want this type of yeast, well, like, that must take you, how long would that take you to, in terms of the research side of things, to find an equivalent or to match it in some way?
Well, that's the challenge, right? Like, right now, each time it's a full, R&D project. But if we keep doing more of it, then we have more and more, basically have a stockpile of options, and then it becomes easier to do this stuff.
Like a bigger catalog, sort of.
Yeah, exactly.
in terms of like time, how long do you think, like R&D, someone says, I want this strain, you haven't really done it before. How long does it take you to,
Well, the cool
to come
thing
up
is anything in yeast is still like really fast. Like I could never be a plant breeder because, you know, you're looking at 10 years minimum to get an idea to market. And, you know, most of the time it doesn't make it that long. Like hops are like that. It's like 10 plus years. There's some efforts to shorten that, but it's crazy. For us with yeast, like we can make a noticeable improvement or change or do breeding in the span of a couple months. So, you know, we can have something that might work very quickly. Obviously, there's always some, you know, testing involved, and that tends to be the bottleneck is, you know, how do you make sure that whatever yeast you've changed or created actually meets, you know, the target or the needs, right? So, you know, those are some questions that we need to answer in the future.
Mm-hmm. Does yeast expire, Richard?
Yes. So that's one of the challenges for us with, you know, with liquid yeast. There's two categories. There's liquid, like fresh liquid yeast, or the dried yeast. They both have their advantages and disadvantages. Advantage of dried yeast is that it's shelf stable. Disadvantage is that there's less selection, sometimes less quality, not always. And then with liquid yeast, the advantage is like you can grow whatever you want, right? We're able to do, if one brewery needs one strain, we can do that for them. So it's like very scalable. The disadvantage is that it's perishable. When it's in that liquid state, you know, you do have to use it within a certain frame of time. Depends on the strain.
Yeah, typically the shelf life would be.
It depends on how you treat it as well. For the pro side of things, we prioritize getting yeast out, you know, quite fresh to the breweries. So most of the times that's like well under 30 days. A lot of it's going out like the week after it's harvested. On the homebrew side, I wish the logistics could work that way. They don't. So we do extend that to typically about 5 months for the homebrew. And what I will say is, you know, a lot of those homebrew packs at 5 months are still really, really good if that has been treated well. Like if it's stayed in the fridge, you know, it hasn't gone through a lot of temperature fluctuations. It's kind of shocking how good the shelf life on these can be if they're treated right. You know, we've done some experiments with like 10-month-old yeast and been shocked at how well it fermented. You know, not every strain, but some strains are shockingly tolerant of you know, sitting around in a fridge for a long time.
I guess with the, you know, like you said, sending out the homebrew shops is probably more so the dried stuff, given that, you know, you're not entirely sure when that yeast is going to be used. I'm assuming that's probably why you've seen. I've just stepped into 1 or 2 homebrew shops. It's usually more so the dried stuff than you can see the liquid stuff. So
you tend to see liquid yeast at the bigger shops that have the volume where it makes sense for them.
Right.
So you might not see it at smaller like brew places, but you'll see it at like a Toronto Brewing or Short Finger in Kitchener, like those kinds of places.
Oh, Short Finger, that's a wonderful spot. I got to meet them at some point.
Oh.
Really friendly.
Great beer too.
Yeah, Richard, is there any brewing in your life, in your future, or are you sticking strictly to being a laboratory, or is that something, do you brew on the side at all, Richard?
Yeah, we have to, like, you know, we have to test the products, right? So it's very important for us to brew. I would say, like, I wish we all, you know, in the company had time to brew more. And, you know, that's really one of the things that we're working on, is making sure that, you know, that's available, because it's really important for us to test the products and, you know about using the products ourselves. So, you know, whether that's using the different strains in research, or whether that's just doing some home brewing on the side and, you know, getting to know our strains better, I think it's really important. So it's something that I know I personally prioritize, is, you know, making sure that I carve out some time for home brewing, or going and doing collaborations with friends as well. You know, there's a lot to learn on either side, and I think it's really important. You know, otherwise it's kind of like we're just making yeast, right? We don't really have as much understanding for, you know, why we're doing this.
See it all the way through, right? You know, right to the finished product. And I'm sure, you know, after yeast has been pitched and home brews have been made, there's obviously some very thorough, rigorous quality control testing, 3 or 4 to 7 to 12 pints of quality control testing, I'm sure.
Yeah. I mean, one of the ways that one of the ways that we know we've got a hit on our hands is if the keg actually gets drank and disappears in a few days, right?
That's true. Yeah.
That was the case for our crispy strain, which is like a kvike that you can use for these lager-like beers. Like that was the fastest a keg of beer ever got consumed at Escarpment, and I think that was a sign that we had something.
Richard, are there any strains you don't touch? They're just out of your wheelhouse. They're just not for you, not your expertise.
That's a great question. I would say the ones that I have the least experience with are like wit and like just like Belgian ale strains in general. I just don't have a lot of experience like brewing those types of beers or working with those types of yeast. So that's kind of my personal blind spot. I have experience with like lagers and saisons and IPAs and sours and all that stuff. But yeah, like the Belgians that's kind of an area where it's like, I'm probably not going to do it better than, the breweries that have been doing it for, years and years and years. So I'm not saying I'm not going to bother, but it's a little bit more of a hill to climb.
Yeah, I'm always confused a little bit when we talk about Belgian beer and because a lot of it does have to do with the yeast. And is that something we just don't have as much in North America? It just hasn't gravitated towards the breweries here or the brewing culture. It's basically stagnated in Belgium or northern France or the Netherlands.
It's kind of come in waves, but I think like one of the challenges is like, yeah, these are some of the most yeast forward beers, but for a lot of those beers, like the yeast management is so critical. And like, if you're not treating the yeast right, then you can get some pretty wacky results. So it is like hard mode brewing in a lot of ways, in my opinion. And it's like no surprise that if you hear the Belgian brewers talking about beer, you'll probably hear them talk about yeast first, right? They have a lot of respect for the yeast and it kind of shines through. And, I think that's totally doable on this side of the pond too. There are some great examples of, breweries that do Belgian style beers in North America really, really well, but it does require like a lot of focus.
Mm-hmm.
I always look for them. Big fan.
Yeah, like Allagash is probably my favorite example. I'm a big Allagash fan, but yeah, we can't get it here. So it's been a long time since I've had either beers.
Well, Richard, we're coming up on the hour mark, but I'm really curious just about just the industry. It just seems really cool and innovative. You seem like a very smart guy. Could you tell me what your favorite part of both your job, both the enterprise that you've started? Why do you get up in the morning? What drives you in the field that you're in?
A lot of things. There's kind of, I'll put it into 2 buckets. Like number one is just seeing all of the ways that our team figures out how to solve problems. Whether that is doing some research that hasn't done before, or just figuring out how to make something work better for ourselves or our customers. Like that's really cool, and then that shines through to the customers. Like that's the other really rewarding piece is hearing from Escarpment Labs customers and hearing about what a difference we make in their lives, both professionally and sometimes personally. Like a lot of craft brewers or home brewers take a lot of pride in what they do, and if we're able to help them do something that they thought they couldn't do, or be more confident, or get better results, or make more money, like that's really rewarding to us. And that's really my favorite thing is if a customer sends a nice note saying thank you for something that we did for them, or just for existing, like that's really, really nice. It's nice to feel valued.
Totally agree. Good feedback keeps you wanting to do what you love doing, and keep providing that service.
Yeah, I think that's a very poignant place to stop. Richard Preiss, thank you very much, from Escarpment Labs in Guelph, Ontario. Richard, we really appreciate the time. We look forward to chatting hopefully again soon.
Thanks, guys. This was great.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Till next time. Have a good one.
Next time.
Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all our interviews and beer-related content. Remember, craft beer is here.